So what I'm going to talk about today is, I called the lecture The Ends of Urban Design, but I'll put that up as a reading because that's a reading that I think is quite important. But instead, because we're not at the end of the lecture series, actually, because we have another lecture next week, which is Cordia Lowe talking about new urbanism and Hedvig talking about Dutch urbanism. In a way, since this is no longer the end, I changed that lecture. So instead, what I thought I'm going to do this week is to try to bring together some of the ideas that how the history and theory aspects and the overview aspects of this semester play out in Cape Town's urban design policy. And I thought it's a useful thing to do because it shows you where things, how things, how international and local ideas play out on a local stage. Because one of the things that's quite interesting is around this idea of principle. And I've always been suspicious of urban design because of the fact that it's so based around principles. And I think principles are dangerous because of the fact that they suggest that every place is the same as every other place, and that a principle that was developed out of looking at Siena is valid when looking at Kailicha. And in actual fact, they're different places. And so I think this balance between principle being a universal thing and sites being specific is a issue for urban design. And so in a way, in putting the lecture series together this semester, what we've been trying to do is find a balance between the international and the local, and to try to also put the international ideas in a historical and theoretical context. And so by looking at the urban design policy of the City of Cape Town, we can start to see those things that one of my old teachers used to call dim resonances, which is how an idea that starts in a different place resonates in another place and gets adapted and gets changed. And so the urban design policy comes from 2013, and it was really a policy that was largely developed by members of UDESA, the Urban Design Institute of South Africa. And last year I was invited to be on a panel that was organised between the property sort of association and UDESA, and that's a relationship that has developed with those guys, which I'm kind of uncomfortable about, because if we do believe in urban design principles, or we do believe in the greater public good, then allying ourselves with a developer organisation is a dangerous thing to do, even if it's good for work. And so this document, I'm just going to walk through the document and pull out certain things that are important. And you can I'll load this document onto Vula. And so it's interesting when you walk through this after our talk this semester to see a few sort of key things. And so what it says in the policy, what is urban design? And it says, urban design is concerned with the process of creating holistic and sustainable urban settlements. Now, if you use that as a definition and you said, describe me a profession, that could be architecture, that could be planning, probably construction economics, probably every developer would say the same thing. So clearly that's not a strong definition of urban design. It might be an aim that urban design might share with a whole lot of other disciplines, and it's all a very valid thing to do. But what does it really come down to? And so one thing that it comes down to a lot of the time for me when I review these things and look at it, I'm often struck by the fact that urban design, it says here it's talking about the form of human settlement. I'll go back to this one in a second. It's talking about the creative process of spatial design. And so one of the things that I think is what really drives urban design, which I'm kind of slightly worried about, is particular ideas about form and space. And so really the kind of the form space thing we talked about in the first week and we've alluded to, but I think it's important to touch on it again. And so when we're thinking about form and space, we're coming from a kind of architectural model of form and space that's tied to modernism. And so when we're talking about space, the term itself, Adrian Forty tells us, comes from Raum in the 19th century. So it's something that's a modern idea. Space was a totally different, and Raum means room, and so the term is tied to enclosure. And the role of form is kind of demonstrated in these diagrams. This is a conventional definition about how aspects of space start to define form, which is the aspects of form define space. And so we start to hear that start to looking at these three models here are in a way where space is defined by implication, and the other ones are where space is defined by forms that create enclosure. So here's Bruno Zevi's analysis of this project by Mies, and that idea of implication is sort of, you can see in this landscape example of how where sort of spatial enclosure defines what space is. And so it's making an assumption about experience. And for me, this is quite important, and one thing that I'm really dogged by personally in teaching in the program is that space, this assumption that space is universal, that everybody experiences space in the same way, that spatial definition is the same. I think that model is primarily a sort of Eurocentric and also primarily a modernistic idea about space. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't believe in it. And in my own research, in my book that's coming out soon, I give a chapter, or part of a chapter over to that idea of space because I believe in it. But one thing that I've noticed through travelling in different cities in Africa is that I'm not sure that the same ideas about spatial definition apply universally. And so if we're bringing urban design principles and applying them to African contexts, can we trust that they work? And I think this is a really important question because currently those international models of space are defining everything. And so when we look at this, the definition is, urban design differentiated on the basis that it introduces the creative process of spatial design. And so when we talk about space, we're talking about form and space. It leads to a whole lot of things that we'll get to because it leads to the idea about one of the reasons why density is important. It leads to ideas about why active frontage are important. And so it's a very implicit idea, but I think one that needs to be questioned. Now, if we go through the policy, one of the things that I think is interesting, and this is me just walking through it, is that its focus is on private development. And I think that this is an interesting question about urban design because, in a way, its assumption is greenfield sites. And so its assumption is fundamentally that either a site is vacant and empty and is going to be built, or a site is going to be regenerated, but basically it's a private site. And so this assumes that the city is built by private development. And so instead, this is slightly different when you think about VPUU, and they do provide examples about that. But it's interesting that this whole policy is focused on the role of developers and ways of trying to lead developers to produce better outcomes. That's not a bad thing. That's quite important. But then you have to ask, what is the role of the city in producing urban design, and how does the city engage and relate to this process? And so if you notice also that there's a sort of scalar metaphor in urban design discussions here, which is to say that the intent of the policy is to focus on the local level, the scale of the site, precinct or neighbourhood. And so it's got a diagram in here which is where it explains how that works. And so obviously we don't have SDFs in the same way that we used to have, but we can see that urban design is seen as a negotiator between detailed district and local area plans and the zoning scheme. And so that's where it's seen as a tool and a mechanism or a scale negotiation between those things. Now, this is different to how I'm seeing urban design because I'm actually probably more interested in this end here, which is urban design as a sort of a spatial interface into planning. Now, that's why the reason I'm more interested in that is because I'm a believer that designers should be allowed as much as possible to exercise their own judgment on sites, but at the same time, the governing framework should ensure that the big scale stuff doesn't get messed up or that the key relationships don't get messed up. Now, that's also what this would be about, but as we go through it, I'll talk to you about some of those issues. But I think that's a useful way to think about it for the planners. Are there any planners here today? 2 planners, 3 planners. So, and in fact, 2 of those planners you're a landscape architect and you're an architect, and you a planner. What's your background? Okay. Okay. And so I think it's interesting to think about the fact that negotiation between the zoning scheme and because the spatial plan is a kind of a very, or the local area plans are very detailed in terms of what they're doing. They're essentially designs of some sort, whereas they're trying to sort of be an intermediate here. Now, if we move across, I think we get to the kind of guts of where the policy, is what it's about. And it's interesting because it talks about a few observations about the problems and the reasons why there needs to be an urban design policy, and those are that the development applications that are submitted to the city should be better conceptualised, particularly when measured against the impact they have on the public domain, and where in many cases urban design considerations are absent. And so here's an interesting thing also, because there's a kind of a way that I kind of get to what this policy is about, which is to some extent micromanaging design. And so if we think about the fact that the way that a capitalist system is operating and a democratic capitalist system is operating in the city, essentially the council reacts to a proposal. So a proposal is made by a consortia or by an architect and planner in relationship to the wants of a developer, and then the city reacts to it. And typically the city is reacting on the basis of its bylaws and its codes. So what if it doesn't like something? What if it actually doesn't like them, but quantitatively and in terms of compliance, it can't do anything about it? And I think that's what the urban design policy is trying to do. It's trying to exercise a level of design control, where urban design is treated as form and space, over individual proposals. Now there's a dynamic here which, again, I'm not against this, but my position politically is, in a way, I think we have to imagine working in different contexts. And so we have to recognise that we do work in a place where development is driven by private property, but also that in a way the system, it actually is about respecting private property. And so this is also a way of affecting private property, which is somewhat contradictory to the way that the city or the way that the system would valorise private property. And so it's interesting that in terms of the policy, its implications are that the urban structure of the city is not legible. Now, we'll get back to this idea of legibility in a bit, and that neighbourhoods are not integrated. Now, obviously, when we talk about integrated, that's an allusion towards apartheid planning. Development detracts from the quality of the public realm. And the reason I emphasise quality is I think that the idea of quality is a fundamental aspect of what urban design is about. But in a way, it comes back to this idea of urban design being a design control on development. And development proposals do not promote safe and secure communities. And they've put a box around these other ones which says opportunities and amenities are inaccessible, development lacks critical mass of intensity, public realm lacks enclosure, informality. All of these ones in this box are things that are actually covered by other policies or other bylaws. And so it's interesting that the idea about urban design here is that it's actually overlapping with, for example, heritage legislation. It's overlapping with NEMA and environmental legislation. It's overlapping with economics. It's overlapping with landscape architecture, with planning in here. And all of those things essentially are governed by other rules. So therefore, what's urban design doing in that space that's otherwise governed? And ultimately, I'm saying it's really trying to be a tool for policing the quality of designs, because all of these things can actually be measured quantitatively. All of them can be either measured quantitatively or either that or they're not actually necessarily involved in design. And so I think that this is where we get to this idea that urban design might be the qualitative tool for urban planning, where in a lot of ways planning is a quantitative mechanism, and it has to be, because of the fact that planning is about defensive. Planning to some extent is always about defensibility. Planning is always about the fact that you can go to court if necessary, and there's something hard and fast there that the developer can either disagree with the terminology of the plan, or the council could disagree with it. So it's about defensibility. And so whereas urban design is actually about qualitative aspects, and this is a problem for this document, which is that it's impotent in the face of the quantitative. Now, at the same time, one of the things that I'm interested in, and Matteo and I are exploring, I suppose, in our work with Grasshopper and parameters, is parameters are always quantitative. So you're always trying to find a qualitative way into a quantity, or I should say the other way around, a quantitative way into a quality, because otherwise you can't express it if you have an algorithm, it's always mathematical. So there's a point at which you're going to have to make an analogy between this particular quantity and this particular quality. And that's an interesting space, and that's why we're operating in this space between planning and an analogy in some sense, because, for instance, every time you use a spatial metaphor, every time you make an idea about how big something should be, you're drawing upon a model of spatiality and formality, which actually comes from a European modernist tradition, or you're working on something like, in fact, you're always working on a particular baseline assumption about space. And so at the same time, you're trying to express it by saying 2.5 metres is too wide, 1 metre is too thin. And so we're in a sort of a measure where we're in between. So in terms of the sort of policy directions, as I've emphasised here, it's interesting to look at when the policy gets triggered. And so this for me is interesting because it's just interesting to think where they think urban design matters. You know, it's interesting that they matter when there's a deviation from the planning vision. So essentially what they're saying is, every time there's a concession, or every time there's a something that doesn't work with the zoning scheme, we need to look at the urban design policy. Every time there's a township, we need to look at a township establishment, we need to look at urban design, 20 urban land units, 1 hectare of space, new public spaces, watercourses and wetlands, shopping centres, commercial developments, etc. And here is a classic and an important one, which is where a delegated official considers that an application has the potential to have a significant negative effect on the public realm. And so this is an interesting one because ultimately that's saying discretion. So even though it's got all of this, ultimately if some planning official or urban design official says, I'm a bit worried about this, then they can trigger it. But interestingly, and so this goes back to this idea of design approval. And the reason I think this is difficult, I'll get to in a few minutes, but it's basically because then we're starting to make aesthetic judgments about other people's designs. And so we're calling it urban design, but we're actually really talking about aesthetics and form, So it's also interesting that in terms of its idea about where it sits, it says that the overarching principles are the greater public good, the whole above the parts, identity, context, and placemaking. Now, there's actually, if we go back to the beginning of this document, it actually says in the beginning that it's about getting the small individual instances of good design right. So there's a kind of, on the one hand, there's a kind of contradiction between an interest in fine-grained small spaces and a desire to work with the whole above the parts. And so this is where, interestingly, its overarching urban design principles are, the first two at least, I would say, are planning principles, and in fact probably all three are planning principles. But one that I'm particularly interested in, and I'm particularly always worried about with urban design, is around what I call manufacturing identity, which is that even though it says the identity changes over time, there's also this idea about placemaking, a consciousness of this layered identity. And it says it's layered, but at the same time, it's talking about the idea that the place has a particular identity. And it's obviously got a particular identity in relationship to ideas about form and space that come from a kind of Eurocentric model. And it's got particular ideas about history, etc., etc. And so this is where I worry about urban design as the arbiter of good taste in the city. Now, if we go to the objectives, it's interesting to look at how they sit. And at this point, I'm going to try to talk about some of the overlaps with our theory to understand what we're talking about. And so one of the things that we're really talking about in the first instance in this policy, which is the objective, which is ensure that development contributes positively to the urban structure of the city to create integrated and legible places and neighbourhoods. Now, I totally would agree with the idea that we want to create, positively contribute to the urban structure of the city. We know from apartheid planning that when you don't do that, it leaves a lasting legacy that is, particularly if we rely upon private development to build the public realm, we know that in a way, the private development has not been able to break apartheid at all. Probably it's been its interest to not break apartheid planning. So it's an example where if you had an urban design policy that also applied to the council, for example, you might expect them to be much more instrumental in breaking the boundaries of apartheid planning and playing with infrastructure more. Now, one term that comes up a lot of the time here is this idea about legibility. And legibility is one of these key urban design terms, which a lot of the time is about wayfinding through the city and about visual cues through the city. And this is where a lot of the time we've been emphasising urban morphological models, but there's also there's other models which I'll talk about which are very much based on these kind of ideas. Legibility also feeds into some of these form space ideas because a legible space is a space that has a definable boundary and a space that has a visual connection to another defined boundary or a linkage to another defined boundary. And so I think on the one hand, this idea about the underlying urban structure I think is a really important idea, which is that the logic of the urban structure, should be, when it says should be communicated in a clear, rational and well-articulated manner. And so that's not just articulated in a document, that's articulated in design form. That's working across boundaries and all of these things. When laying out development cluster facilities. Now, this one I thought is an interesting question because if we're talking about clustering facilities, what happens to the corner shop or the spaza store? How do you work within those systems? Like on the one hand, there's a critique of zoning that's been happening that's been saying we should be focusing on multi-use, we should be focusing on getting rid of single-use precincts. But at the same time, clustering is moving towards an idea about zoning. And I think that an interesting question here is that around this sort of contradiction that I'll talk about a little bit later between the fact that we want to encourage informal trade and we want to encourage entrepreneurial development in townships and informal settlements so that there's some sort of economic benefit to the community, but we're also wanting to cluster in certain sorts of ways. And as soon as we start clustering, we start saying only certain people can afford to come in here or not come in here, or the alternative it is the sort of City of Cape Town thing where you mark a rectangle and you say to the informal trader, please come in here, but make sure you stay inside this rectangle. There's one of those kind of issues. There's also this discussion, and so this is me just playing between the two because I think that to some extent a rich place will allow for things to arise in it. And so if we, for instance, start to think about over time those places that are the models of the hill towns and various places that happened in Europe, those places and those sort of nodes, a lot of them evolved through the internal dynamics or emerged through the internal dynamics of what was happening there at the place in time. So I worry a little bit about this idea that everything should be clustered because I think it always, again, assumes that this is a greenfield, whereas in actual fact, probably the more interesting things are about things that can happen within existing fabric, and that's not really considered in this code. Now, when we look at the models that they're talking about here, in terms of these ideas, intensification of development to a route, clustering order of facilities in nodes and natural systems, what we see here are those things that we will recognise from Lynch and also from Dave Dewar, which is around paths, nodes, edges, etc. And so this is the operationalisation of that language from that period. And even though it's operating at a particular scale, when we see the work of Dave, and this is also Lucien Lagrange and Pete Lowe here, we're also, we're seeing at a larger scale it's another version of that sort of process. And so that's where that plays out in amongst this, is around these ideas. clustering facilities into nodes, working along paths, and also natural systems, which we'll talk about later. Now, another one, the second objective is to ensure that development contributes to the quality of the public realm and public spaces. Now, this is a really important one. Obviously, this is my primary area that I operate in because of the fact that it's a landscape architecture. But I think that when we go to this first point here, when it says open space must be created intentionally and should never be residual or leftover space, we're in a really interesting point when we look at something like Mitchell's Plain. And so if we look at Mitchell's Plain, you'll see school, and you'll see that those spaces, that the schools always have these open spaces around them. And so interestingly, this scheme was created at a time when they also said intentionally, best practice is to put space around the school, to create these open space linkages. And so, in fact, all of those spaces were created intentionally. But they also became residual and leftover spaces. And so those things happened over time. And largely it was because of something that's picked up here, which is that they were thinking about public space as quantitative rather than qualitative. And this is one of the problems in planning that we feel the effects of in landscape a lot, is that space is allocated, but space is not designed. And so essentially without qualities, public space becomes the no man's land. So it's not even about quantity, it's about the qualities that result from the quantity. It also talks about the aggregation of certain things, and I think that I always think of what I call the Barcelona model here, which is that Barcelona had a really interesting model not interesting, it's a common sense model, it's actually a Haussmann model as well, which is that when one develops an area, one is developing something where we're developing a sort of a concept between public space, a civic and public use, some sort of infrastructure node or system, and some sort of private housing thing and some sort of employment thing. So every project ideally would always try to work with that overlap where public space has a relationship to something that catalyses investment, something that provides a public service, something that provides transport, and something that provides housing. And I mean, that's a basic thing, and I think it's something that Barcelona, after the Olympics, did really well. And you can see here is a range of projects where in Barcelona after the independence, or not after independence, but after the end of the dictatorship, they began sewing all of these public projects that had these kind of suites of things into different parts of the city. And the term urban acupuncture is often used to describe that. And so, the second principle I probably have, I have a lot of sympathy for, but I keep asking, a lot of these also assume that there's this term that always comes through here, which is what they call a positive interface. And so these are, it says avoid arranging buildings such that rear and backs of private property face onto the public realm, unless there is certainty that the buildings will be designed to provide a positive interface. And so this is a key thing which links into one of the later policies around safety. So every time we have a building address that is facing away from a public space, we have places that are not surveilled. And so if again look at Mitchell's Plain, we can see a lot of places that are like that or have an ambiguous relationship. So for example, this sort of parking court here, that becomes the front entry. This is then back fences along the boundary, and that whole strip then becomes the back of something. And so as much as possible, that's something that one should avoid, and I can agree with that as a principle. I think that's reasonable, and Matteo and I have talked about this idea about whether or not a building can face two ways, and it can't, can it? But, and so this then links to the next principle or objective, which is ensure that developments contribute to the creation of safe and secure communities. Now, this is, of course, a really important thing, and I think it's worth looking at some of the ways where this has come from, because urban design is an aggregate of a lot of stuff, and so one of those things that it's come from is something that's known as CPTED. And CPTED stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And so I came across this first because I was working in public housing in Melbourne, and we were working on what at that stage was known as social exclusion, which was really around, or avoiding social exclusion, which was really about trying to create welcoming public spaces. And so CPTED really was focused on these things. And I think it's interesting to talk about them quickly, which is that there's some problems in them. These were developed by the police, right? So you have to recognise that this is a police thing. And so some of them, which is interesting, is this one here, which is called territorial reinforcement, is interesting because of the fact that it's arguing that space needs to be owned. Now, in reflection, I would say that is true, which is to say, when space is not owned, it's actually becomes there's a lack of responsibility for it. And so a lot of the time in the 60s and 70s, and in the 80s, but more that period, a lot of public spaces were created in this quantitative mechanism, which is to say, we'll take a modernist thing, densify, give as much public space as possible. But because that public space had no sense of ownership to it, people didn't take a responsibility for it. One is it fell into disrepair, but the other one is that people didn't treat that space as something that they were looking at, that they owned, that they cared for, with all the senses of the social that associate with that. Legitimate activity support obviously means that when there's an activity there, you try to facilitate that activity as much as possible. And so we can see that activity is something that allows for a energising of space. Maintenance is obviously around the idea that a cared for space feels like a safe space. And that idea of that sense of it is really important. Natural surveillance is around overlooking, which is that we orientate windows and frontages as much as possible onto public space, so there's as much passive surveillance. Natural access control is interesting, which is a recognition that with territorial reinforcement, there needs to be actually a question about access. And so remembering this came from public housing in the UK, which I should add is pretty rough. A lot of this was about things like tailgating, which is where if you're walking into a block of flats, as you push the door open, someone comes straight in behind you. And that's a process known as tailgating, and that's a lot of the way that people who don't live in places get into places. So this is recognising that there needs to be, with this, some sense of spatial control. And this one, target hardening, is probably the dodgiest one, because this is actually profiling. So this is recognising in policing where the crime is happening and finding definitive perps. And so this is a police sort of model, but out of this comes the next model, which is really focusing more on the meta ideas at the next level about how these things happen. So somewhere here between legitimate activity support and territorial reinforcement, there is a community culture. When we're talking about territorial reinforcement again and natural surveillance, again we're talking about social cohesion. Threshold capacity is to say where is the edge, how are we working with inside, outside, etc. Community connectivity is around the idea that people own space and maintain it. Now, when you look at VPUU's stuff, you can see that it's much more coming from this second generation CPTED model, which is a meta model on top of the first generation of stuff. But when you're talking about things like situational crime prevention, what you're actually talking about is the same target hardening that they're talking about there. And so I mention those things just to talk about the fact that that's also they called it environmental design, but safety has also now become one of the key objectives of urban design, and probably very tied to density, which I'm pretty sure is the next one. So also one of the questions I ask is why is this not expected of normal residential development? And so why is it that, for example, when you're in suburbia, it's acceptable to have a solid wall to the street, when in actual fact, by changing the fencing rules, you could still maintain safety, but at least allow for a passive surveillance of the street. So why is this only affecting things that are over 20 dwelling units, that are over 1 hectare, etc.? Why is this not a normal part? Now, the fourth objective is to ensure opportunities and amenities are accessible and that people can move about easily and efficiently. And so the first part about this is, provide spatial connections between and through existing and new neighbourhoods. And so, this is where, in the first instance, this is a kind of dislike or a dislike of the cul-de-sac. And so this is a process of trying to redress the suburban housing movement of the 1960s and 70s, well, more 1950s, 60s, 70s. And so there's that process, urban design to some extent. If we look at the Urban Design Conference, where the first program was started at Harvard in 1954, the mandate specifically was about redressing the non-urbanism of suburbia. And so in a way, to some extent, urban design comes from a place of stopping suburbia. You can't ignore the fact that that's where it started. But it also, in that process, acknowledges or fails to acknowledge the fact that people have specific reasons why they've chosen to live in those places, and you can't ignore those reasons. They might be around safety. The cul-de-sac does things like it allows kids to play at the end of it because there's no through traffic, and so it's not actually as straightforward as being able to just say, we don't like it. So on the one hand, as you know, I'm an urban morphology guy, so I like connectivity and throughness, but on the other hand, I recognise that the cul-de-sac has value that the market wants. Now, if we look at sorry, I've just lost myself momentarily. If we look at the cul-de-sac, I had a student project, and I've run quite a few projects like this about playing with suburbia. So here's a kind of classic piece of cul-de-sac landscape in Australia, and I've been running a few studios about trying to find ways over time to change through development processes suburbia that was operating in a cul-de-sac fashion to make it more permeable. And this is one of my students, Lachlan, who was actually looking at how, as a block gets sold, it can get bought, as back fences can be set up and things can be moved around. There's ways of both allowing for the cul-de-sac to happen, but allowing for it to also be connected through to other pieces of suburbia. And so also we have to recognise in terms of this idea, there's another one here about pedestrian desire lines and distances. And I think pedestrian desire lines are incredibly important, and particularly in South Africa, where a lot of people walk and a lot of people catch taxis, where in a way the city is not able to register those informal movement systems in its planning processes. I think that's really important. But the dominant model for all of this is actually TOD, and we've talked a little bit about TOD. And so TOD is, comes from Calthorpe, transit-oriented design. And so, that model, just to show how that plays out, obviously that model is around the distribution of nodes around walking distances, the idea of open space linkages, hierarchies of on the one hand, a kind of separation of the large-scale infrastructure system, the creation of different levels of typology around the street that are about sort of allowing for pedestrianisation, maintaining internal neighbourhood driving links that still connect to larger systems. And so this is the kind of TOD system, and all of these tied to a kind of transit boulevard where the distance between it is 400 metres. So that's now a universal idea, but is affected by other factors. So, for example, you can have the walking distance. Manenberg would have the walking distance, and Mitchell's Plain would have the walking distance, but would you want to walk it because of safety? And so this is where we start to find that there's synergies between those things. So probably when people were setting out those places, they were probably ready for those sort of TOD systems, but in actual fact, they weren't able to maximise them because of other imperatives. Now, objective number 5 is promote development, intensity, diversity, and adaptability. And obviously, this is where I've got this thing that I refer to as, the density police. And I refer to them as the density police because in the same way that there's a problem with treating open space as quantity, in a way, the same is true with density, which is that we can argue for density, but for instance, informal settlements are very high density. But is that necessarily the model of development that people want? People live there, and I'm not being judgment about it, but I'm saying you can't use density just as the thing that dictates everything. There's also a lot of landscape issues with density. As soon as you start to work with density, you're reducing garden, you're reducing domestic recreational space. And so this is where, in a way, focusing perhaps on density and coverage at the same time, where you're maximising density and minimising coverage at the same time, is almost a better indicator. What happens at that model? What's the end of that model? The Villa Radius and Le Corbusier, everything in towers, masses of open space. So I'm quite a big believer in the fact that we need to be more innovative around typologies that hand over a lot of landscape but also maintain density. Now, one of the reasons why that's important ecologically is that if we don't have open ground, we don't recharge aquifers. We take our sites out of the natural system because effectively once you hard pave a site and then connect it into a stormwater system, all you're doing is collecting water and putting it into the sea. The sea's got heaps of water. It doesn't need more water. The ground needs water. And so this is where site coverage is a massive factor, particularly in places like Cape Town, and even worse in cities that are really clay cities where you're starting to find cracking of buildings because aquifers are drying out. Now, so I don't think density solves everything. I think probably the biggest one is actually adaptability, because really the cities do develop, and that should be their primary thing that happens, insofar as they should be able to accommodate change. And this is where I think the danger of taking this type of urban design approach, which is a greenfield approach on individual sites, rather than taking a public approach, really misses the point potentially because of the fact that the developer is never thinking about adaptability. The developer is always thinking about yield. And so, if you go to it, when I went to this forum with these property developers, all they wanted to talk about was bulk. How much can they get on the site? That's all they wanted to talk about. And so this is where I think when we're talking about this idea about adaptability, we need to be thinking more about things like how would this get demolished? How would two sites get joined? How would things get separated? What happens if we wanted to change a 3-bedroom flat into a whole lot of single-bedroom apartments? And so we're starting to look at really starting to make judgments about inside building envelopes or in relationship to sites. And interestingly, if you look at these kind of developments, that's not adaptable. That building is not an adaptable building necessarily. And I think it's the thing about what becomes adaptable is actually separation. So on the one hand, we want things to be joined together. We want them to be dense, but on the other hand, it's actually separation that will allow for adaptability so that we can demolish one next to the one next to it, So really it's the modularity and the separation that is a key thing. Then when it talks about, and so on the one hand, it wants this sort of idea about intensity, but at the same time, that intensity reduces adaptability. So again, we're starting to have this thing of intensity and bulk, single object, less adaptable. Diversity, they're talking about diversity of architecture, where I think it's interesting to look at the fact that in this drawing, the way that they deal with diversity is they put this little guy on the top of this place, right? So this is its way of saying, see, I'm not all the one thing. I'm different at the same time as I'm the same. I'm looking like I'm two frontages, but I'm actually one frontage because I've got this little hat on. And so this is where a lot of the time these guidelines produce a kind of camouflage where in actual fact we have one site envelope that feels like two site envelopes. But is it working like two site envelopes, or is it just trying to pretend that it looks like one site envelope? And so when we, one of the things that is also interesting here, and I think this is an adaptability thing, again, is around urban morphology and historic street patterns. So the next one here talks about ensuring closure and positive interfaces onto the public realm. So positive again, so there's such a thing as a negative and there's such a thing as a positive. So we have, inherently this is a certain sort of language that comes also from ideas about vibrancy and all of this sort of thing. We see these pictures, and a lot of this urban design is based around these type of renderings that are about, a street that is absolutely going ballistic. There's like so much trade, there's so many happy people, there's everything is so green, it's so articulated, it's all of this sort of, on the one hand it looks rich, but it's actually a monoculture because its whole fabric is the same thing where it's actually a singular development that's being developed in such a way that it seems like a whole series of things. Now, another approach might be to instead focus on smaller parcels that are separate and encourage development that allows for real diversity and real change over time. But instead, this is actually a process of faking an old street. And again, this idea about this positive relationship is about enclosure. So when we talk about that, I think it's important I realise that we haven't properly talked about this. There's one book we didn't talk about, and that's definitely something which we will fix up next year because this is highly important book. This book is Responsive Environments, and this is tied to a university called Oxford Brookes in the UK. And Oxford Brookes is one of the main urban design schools around the place. And so Bentley teaches at Oxford Brookes. And you'll see in this, there's a few principles here that really are now keywords. And so when you look at it, you'll see that the terms are, legibility, again, we can see, is around this idea that there is there's a wayfinding, an ability and a clarity to form such that people know how to move through it. Permeability goes back to the idea that is like pro-grid, anti-cul-de-sac, is like, in spatial syntax terms, it would be about being able to get right the way through all the time to all places. Personalisation is this idea that one can customise one's own space. Richness, visual, and I'll get to this one in a second, I particularly hate. Variety, what's this one say? Robustness, is it tough? And I think that when we get to this point, visual appropriateness, that's when we're starting to get into slightly dodgy territory. So to some extent, the rest of them, I can live with them. I think they're reasonable. But in actual fact, the visual appropriateness one is the one that is actually dominating everything. And it's where we find the biggest differences between different urban design approaches. And so if we look at this image in terms of that sort of, that rubric there, what we discover is that it's legible because it's spatially defined. And so again, we're going back to this form-space model, which is that it's legible because it's a clear sense of its streetness. It's clearly defined on the one hand. It's permeable. We can't see that so much here, but we can see that it's got this idea of variety that they're trying to work with inside this structure. And the visual appropriateness one is really about the idea that that everything blends together, which we'll talk about in a second. And so the slight move around here, which is now Objective 7, is development should recognise and respond appropriately to informality. Now this is finally the first one that is actually specific to Cape Town. So all of the other 6 principles we could find in Responsive Environments, or we could find in Kevin Lynch. And so it's only at this point that we get to something that is noticeably from this context. And so I think that, the key thing is around, this one here, respond proactively to informality at the site level by focusing on interventions within the public realm to see the sites that are used on a daily basis. Such interventions could include the formalisation of movement routes, the provision of facilities, the provision of basic infrastructure services. And so what we're noticing here, and the key point which I'll underline next time, is formalisation. And so this is something which is like a lot of discussion around this in economics, which is that up until I read it when I first came here. I found a sort of like a Nose Week or one of these magazines that was talking about the cannibalization of the informal sector by the formal sector, which is to say, once you've got a monopoly of some sort, you can offer anything cheaper than the informal sector can offer it. And so, for instance, that's why the informal sector is selling goods from China, because the informal sector cannot make those goods cheaper than China can fabricate them. And so this idea that formalisation is a good thing, I think is not a good thing in a lot of the time. So what ultimately happens is that largely, and this is something you'd see all over Africa, you'll find people on street corners selling MTN phone cards in every city in Africa. And in actual fact, all they're doing is brokering for a large organisation. So you have to think the only guys who are really doing informal trade a lot of the time are the guys who are making stuff that they're selling at intersections, etc., with beads, etc. So that if you think about how much of the informal sector is actually not just brokering for the formal sector, that's quite problematic, right? And so the problem here, this thing about formalisation is problematic, and I think that if you look at a lot of the projects that happen, for instance, Katie, you'll be able to tell me the project by VPU and Tana that's out at that railway station. It's not. What's it called?
Yanga Junction.
No, not Nyanga Junction. It's another one. Maybe it is, but it's one where basically they built a bus terminal for taxis and none of the taxis use it because of the fact that it's not really on the taxi route. And so this idea that you can provide something that the taxis will use, when in actual fact the taxis are fleet-footed. The whole interesting thing about the taxis is they can go where they need to go on the basis of emerging conditions. So this is where really what you're doing is that how do you plan for something that is actually about a time-based practice? It's about working in time. It's not working in an object. It's not about formalisation. It's not about putting edges. It's about a time-based practice. How do you do that? How do you work with that? Because ultimately otherwise you'll have this idea that I build a catalyst, the catalyst causes X to happen. But this is where you can't assume that you know the dynamics of what's happening in that system, really. And so there's a book that Matteo has mentioned, which is a kind of interesting idea around that, and it's by this guy, David Gouverneur, and it's called Planning for Future Informal Settlements. And his argument is something that I'm quite sympathetic to, which is really that is in a way it's around recognising the processes of informality and in fact encouraging those processes via the provision of systems to facilitate them. And so, for example, he's working with these ideas about the fact that, there's certain infrastructures you could provide that would allow for informal settlement to happen in a certain place. Like say you started an informal settlement, or say you started a development just by installing a sewer line. So instead of going to the situation where you say, we now have to provide sewer to an informal settlement, what if you just found a piece of land and put in a whole lot of sanitation hardware? Probably people would and then say, guys, there's sanitation hardware over there. And then what if you then put a limit on the space because of the way you then, for instance, maybe worked with foundations set up, etc. And so Governor's approach is really to say, let's provide attractors and let's then work with those attractors in certain sorts of ways, He talks about pirate development. And so really it's recognising those sort of forces that are occurring. Now, Governor also, we saw something like this in Kampala last year, which was really interesting, where the council was providing lights to spaza shops. So rather than having to install themselves lights, what they said is, if you we'll let you create your new shop, and here's a light, but now you have to install the infrastructure to get it to you. So instead, what it's saying is it's actually it's getting the informal sector to build the infrastructure, but rather than saying no to informality, it's letting the informality install the urban infrastructure. It's a time-based approach because it's got a system where the system rolls out in response to what's happening, as compared to the idea that it's building everything up front. And so I think that's an interesting question. Now, when we get, when it says, development should protect value and enhance the natural environment through sustainable design. Obviously, my main thing is hire a landscape architect. But we can recognise in this that there is the influence of McHarg on urban design, which has been significant. And so again, that's a local thing where everyone was educated here at University of Pennsylvania. Ian McHarg was teaching at that time. Dewar and Aiton Burkhart and all of those guys were influenced by him. And so that's a conjunction that we can see there. And I won't go into that too much because of Clinton's lecture. But and then the ninth one, and the one that is the one I'm going to end on, and that is for me the really dangerous one, which is this idea that development should respect and enhance the heritage, character, and unique identity of the city and its neighbourhoods. And so what you can see if you look at this here is that here is a new development, and here is a new development, and you can see that these measures are designed to put them in place. Now, I don't actually have a problem with a designer deciding that that's an interesting thing to do, but obviously the danger we have is that with it comes a certain sort of nostalgia. And so, you can see here, this is a kind of classic Congress of the New Urbanism thing, where the model of urban design is inherently tied to this sort of conservative and backward-looking modality. And so the reason why we've talked about people like Koolhaas is to try to emphasise that there is a kind of counter-narrative to urban design. There is a narrative that is based probably more about performance and less about aesthetics. And next week, Cordia Lowe will be talking about a new urbanism because she's attended a few of those conferences, so she'll go into that more. But these sort of character things, I think, are very much the most dangerous aspects of urban design, because we have to remember that the old was new once. And so here is this image of Paris, and we look back at that as a nostalgic image, but at the same time, when you look at that building and how it's drawn and how the perspective works within it, you can think that this was the height of the modern at the time. So if we're now basing everything we're doing on the relationship to something because it was old, when it was created, its innovation was that it was new, we're in a retrograde approach to the city. And so this is where, Henry Comrie once said to me, and I think it's a fair thing to say, he said, urban design is inherently conservative. It's inherently, he would say it's inherently conservative because it's inherently about respect for the existing. And interestingly, if you look at, for instance, we'll go to Koolhaas again, if you look at his work at the Biennale, what year was he running the Biennale? Was it 2011 or 2012 or something? And his focus was actually on heritage on that, and I think that there's a real value in maintaining heritage, but I think it's less about responding sensitively and using horizontal rhythms than fighting hard to preserve things that should be covered by heritage legislation. So if something's got quality, save it, but then make the best contribution you can make. And I think this is where, if we take a kind of performative model about what we want to do in urban design, and we don't let it be, pig, dog, ugly thing, then at least we're in a position where we're focusing on what it does, and we're letting the designers of it work with what it is. Because ultimately, Matteo and I are educating people to be, independent thinking designers, doing their best with what they're designing and providing a contribution to the city. And it would be, for me, I feel like it's hypocritical to then say, no, you can only do this thing. Ultimately, I want my students to produce a piece of design that takes me by surprise, not that actually makes me think of every other thing that's been done before. So there's a contradiction between being interested in design and then wanting to be about the controlling of design to keep it within quote-unquote context. And I think that's where you have an interesting thing between code-based approaches, which is where new urbanism goes, in terms of what's known as form codes. And so I'm not interested in form codes as much as I'm interested in sort of performance codes. And I do think that there's a value in setting height limits and these kind of things. But I think once you've done that, I think, we should start to think about letting this letting a designer express their best work with what they're doing, you know. And so to get to the end of this policy, one of the parts that's most interesting probably if you look at it is that, you know, there is actually no formal power to this piece of policy. It's a piece of policy, it's a piece of advice. It's not a piece of legislation, it's not a bylaw. And so ultimately what happens here, and this was actually the starting point of the new urban design program here, was that Kathy, what's Kathy's surname from the city, ex-city? You know, I can't remember her name, but the previous head of planning at the city of Cape Town, who was replaced by Melissa Whitehead, when she and I met about the urban design program, she said to me, this policy is problematic because it's got no formal power to it. It's only suggestions. I can't enforce it because what happens is inevitably if it ends up in a sort of a situation where we have to have some sort of fight on paper, the policy has no legs. And in actual fact, everything that happens in the bylaws and in planning. And so this is where I'm interested in is less working towards the idea of governing design and more towards visualising planning and modifying planning practice and modifying bylaws to understand the effects they have. Because one thing that's been good about the planning process is that it provides something that individuals react to and can react to individually. Planning, I feel like, gets a really hard time for what it's trying to do, but in actual fact, most of that is because designers feel that their designs are being impinged with. Why not get rid of all of the attempt to control design, but instead focus on what certain things do? We know that something built across something is going to block it. We know that these things are going to work these ways. What if we stayed at the design implications of planning policy and then let designers respond to them rather than trying to tell designers how to design? So, any questions? Comments?
Comments? Many. I mean, that just to try to